Hello and welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, bias, disparate impact, and good governance. So today I'm going to talk about some of the exciting events that have been happening. I think, and some of the things that some of the meetings that I've been to, and some of the things that I've seen, and reflect on sort of what they mean and sort of the state of what auditing is looking like now. So last week I did go over sort of the ecosystem of algorithm audit, and talking last week basically about all of the various laws that are in the pipeline or are already here. And so now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about certain laws, certain initiatives, and what it might mean for algorithm auditing and AI governance in general. So the first thing I was not going to talk about this first, but it's happening right this very second, and so I was just watching it right before I jumped on the webinar, which is the launch of NIST's AI risk management framework. And so if you want to go watch that, you can leave and go to the NIST website, and they're having panel discussions, and it's a big affair. And so it's super exciting, and you know, we meaning BABL as a company commented on the risk management framework. We've been following it very closely. We know a lot of people on the committee. We know that community very well, and we're quite excited about this risk management framework. And the reason is, even though this is a voluntary framework, there are no laws currently saying you have to follow the NIST AI risk management framework. The kind of guidance that NIST gives out tends to have a lot of normative oomph, a lot of value. People pay attention to it, and in areas of risk management in general, cybersecurity, the things that NIST produces tend to get adopted by industry, and they start becoming required, and whole ecosystems spring up around the things that NIST produces. So it's exciting that now there's this document which has a framework for managing risk related to AI. And I have to say, it's a good framework. It's not complete by any means. There's a long way to go towards figuring out exactly how it's going to get implemented in particular instances, and that's what companies like us focus on, is that practical step of how do you then put it into practice in a given industry, in a given scenario, or a use case. However, the one major benefit is that they do spend a lot of time focusing on something that we've been talking about a lot, and I think everybody is now realizing is this socio-technical component of the risk management, is that you can't just look at the technical issues of the algorithm. I mean, those are very, very important, and of course, a lot of the report does focus on the technical issues, but it has to be sort of tied in with all of the various risks that come from the socio-technical system in which these algorithms are embedded. And so this is very exciting that it's there. And I think what you're going to find happening very quickly is that there are going to be a lot of companies that are going to start requiring of their vendors that they follow some version of the NIST AI risk management framework. It may not be immediate, but you will start seeing as large companies like Microsoft, Google, IBM, all of the big tech companies, when they procure tools that are AI first for their platform, or when they are using them in their systems, they're going to start requiring some level of this framework being put into place, and documentation around to prove that has been put into place. And I think this puts a lot of pressure, and potentially also some assurance that has been put into place. And what that means is auditing. And so I think I know for a fact that BABL we're implementing and starting to work on coming up with audit criteria associated with this risk management framework, and because it's going to be needed, they're going to need to be people who can demonstrate that they have they live up to that standard. Now, you can't just apply it with the current document. That's why you need to have criteria. And I think ForHumanity is the nonprofit that comes up with audit criteria. I think you'll see ForHumanity very quickly wrapping this risk management framework into the one that they currently have. And I think they're actually quite complementary, so that there are a lot of that criteria already done and finished. So this is very exciting. Now, this does connect quite nicely to several of the forthcoming laws that I was talking about previously. And so, for instance, there's a law that has passed in Colorado, which, and I forget the name of it now, but I can look back in my presentation from last week. But this law, it governs financial services and in particular insurance. And one of the requirements is of having a risk management framework in place. Now, the law doesn't specify what that risk management framework should look like. And there are frameworks, in particular model risk management, which are used in financial services, and that has been kind of folded into the AI risk management framework that NIST uses, because I think they relied quite heavily on some of those principles. And so I think what you'll see is that this will probably get adopted as a standard for risk management when using AI in insurance settings, either for underwriting or other kind of processes you'd need for insurance. And so that's likely, you're going to likely see this happening. And so there is a lot of talk, and I went to some of the open meetings, stakeholder meetings for this Colorado law, and the people who are working on it, the regulators who are trying to come up with the rules for this, have explicitly mentioned auditing as one thing that they're considering, and part of the question in their mind is there an ecosystem for this? And this is actually a theme that has come up over and over again in the past couple of weeks, and I'll revisit this. But that's an exciting connection. Now, the other connection I can see is what's happening in Europe, because there are two regulations. There's the EU AI Act, and there's the Digital Services Act. There's more. There's a whole digital package associated with that Europe is trying to sort of implement. But both the EU AI Act and Digital Services Act explicitly have auditing. Less so in the AI Act, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of discussion about whether these conformity assessments are going to cut it in terms of enforcing the law, and whether it needs to be a lot more hands-on sort of third-party auditing of these systems. But in the Digital Services Act, for sure, there's going to be explicit auditing for these large platforms. And so, as a little background, the Digital Services Act is an act which is meant to regulate large social media platforms, basically, or large search engines. So for search engines, think Google and similar. And social media is all the ones that would be Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all of these, TikTok. And for those really large platforms, there are explicit requirements for auditing. And so, and in both the EU AI Act and the Digital Services Act, risk management is a key feature. Companies need to manage their risk, and there are a bunch of different ways in which they kind of explicitly say they need to do it, related to assessments that happen prior to going on the market, and then post-market monitoring once the systems are operational in the European market. And so I think what we'll find is that The NIST risk management framework for AI is sitting there waiting, and I think what we're going to see a lot of the elements of that get incorporated quite readily into what the Europeans are going to expect. That doesn't mean there's not going to be another standard on top of that that gets developed, but I think the core of this risk management is already there and waiting, and it's a good standard. There are other standards, of course, that are out there, like IEEE is working on them. Like I said, ForHumanity has a really great one, but NIST does tend to carry a lot of weight, even internationally, and so this is I think connected, and it bodes well for a lot of these legislation or a lot of these laws that are kind of requiring some level of standard. This is a good starting point. Okay, so let me continue that thread. So this is going to be, I definitely am babbling today, so there's a lot on my mind. Let me continue that thread with the European Act, because last week I was lucky enough to be invited to a workshop which was convened on behalf of the European Commission to consider what to do with the delegated act on auditing, which is an act that is, they explicitly say in the Digital Services Act that auditing is required. They also say that that you can have a delegated act on top of that, which sort of specifies what this auditing might look like. And so the European Commission is trying to figure out, what does this look like? And so I was lucky enough to be invited. There are a number of people there. I can't say who was there. I can talk very generally about what was in the meeting, but I can't say specific things about what specific people said. But it was all the usual suspects would be there that for auditing, traditional auditing firms for the most part. And I think that what's trying to be decided now is what is auditing going to look like for these systems. And this is something I had yesterday. I was in a meeting in not a workshop, but it was a sort of a webinar. The Catholic University of Chile organized around algorithmic auditing. They invited me nicely as a guest to speak, and a lot of the similar themes came up. Like, what does algorithm auditing look like? Now, I have to be careful because in the Digital Services Act, there are lots of requirements that these platforms have to have. They have to implement risk management frameworks. They have to do user experience testing. There are risk and impact assessments related to fundamental rights, and not just fundamental rights, but risk and impact, any kind of harm. And then there's, of course, the technical testing of the systems. And in the Digital Services Act, they're really focusing on recommender systems, and which is sort of tells what content are you seeing and how does your feed get populated, and also advertisement serving systems. So this is like tracking personal data and serving individual advertisements to people. And these algorithms are pretty complex, and it's definitely complex to a person who's never looked at them before. But they are getting increasingly more and more complex. And so it's not just algorithmic auditing per se. This is auditing in general for compliance with a regulation. And so the big question here is, what exactly is that going to look like? When you have an auditor come in and say, is this company compliant with the regulations? What does it take to put that in place? And I think in this meeting, there are a lot of kind of important issues brought up. And I think one of the major ones is that the law as it's currently written doesn't give enough guidance for auditors to have any kind of reasonable assurance. And there are different levels of assurance that you could give. You can't really take the law as it's written and just and audit somebody for that law. There has to be a lot more guidance for an auditor. And we've known this, and this is why kind of ForHumanity exists to create some of these rules, is that it's very difficult to rely on an auditor to make a judgment call, like, is this good enough? Is it not good enough? And if you have different auditors making different judgment calls, then the person who audits Google is going to give you a different answer than the person who audits Twitter, than the person who audits Facebook or whatever. And so it was very obvious that there has to be some kind of criteria that's going to be uniformly applied when these audits are done. And I think that it was kind of obvious that the commission is not going to be the one to do that. And it also became obvious that the auditors themselves didn't feel comfortable or didn't feel like they should do that. And I agree with that. And so in general, I think the consensus was there needs to be some third party that does this, that comes up with these criteria. That's one. The other bit that was discussed, and I think I pushed this issue, is that there are differences between the standard audit or assurance for regulatory compliance and what's happening with these sort of algorithm audits. And the main difference, I think, and I talked about this last week, is that there are complexities which are really hard to deal with. And the complexities have to do with the fact that this is a rapidly evolving field, both in terms of the technology itself. So let's say the recommender systems or the advertising systems are evolving really quickly. And so if you're an auditor auditing these systems and looking at the tests that these companies have done and looking at the data, you have to be very nimble and understand these sorts of systems. And because they're changing so fast, that's problematic. The other problem is that the evolving understanding of how these systems affect society and people. The field of impact assessments for algorithms, AI ethics, AI governance, whatever you'd like to call it, there's sort of intersections between all of these, is very new. And, I know us as an organization, we have a research division called the Algorithmic Bias Lab, and we are conducting research on sort of AI governance mechanisms, trying to figure out what works. And I have to say that there isn't a lot of evidence yet to know exactly which of these controls and mechanisms are going to actually do a good job mitigating the harm. And at the same time, we don't know all of the ways in which they can harm or can affect society. And so the second bit is that the field itself is rapidly evolving. And so to come up or enshrine standards right now to deal with that is a real art. You have to think, you have to allow for our evolving understanding of how these systems affect people in society. So that's another complication. The third complication comes from the fact that you can't just have anybody do it. And it relates to the first two complications. Because of those first two complications, the evolving nature of the technology and the evolving nature of how the technology, our understanding of how the technology affects people, means that there are not a huge number of people that are equipped to actually make judgment calls. And even if you have a set of criteria, so let's say some organization, maybe it's ForHumanity, maybe it's some European organization who comes up with a criteria for the Digital Services Act. Let's be real specific for a second, for what's compliant and what's not. When an auditor comes in, an auditor has to check for compliance against that criteria. And there also has to be a verification process to make sure that the statements that are made by the company or the large platform are actually true. Now, in the process of doing these audits, one important issue is risk. Like, what's the risk of material misstatement? What's the risk that the things that this company is doing are not actually effective and are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or might have some missing information? This risk is really important for the auditing process. But there are not a huge number of people who actually know enough about the first two things to actually evaluate that risk well. It's not just that you need an auditor who is very good at doing auditing, that sort of the the process of doing this verification, you also need people who are able to weigh those risks and know whether you need to go deeper, whether the testing that they showed you is actually really representative of how the algorithm might work, for instance, or whether the risk assessments that they've done and documented and showed the auditor are appropriate risk assessments which will actually mitigate harm. Now, in the future, as we get better and better at understanding what are the requirements for getting these risk assessments down really well, or what are the tests and what are the ways these algorithms might go wrong. Once we get really good at that, then yes, it's likely that it will be a checklist, and that as long as you get all of that stuff in the checklist done, everything will be fine. And then the skills and knowledge that an auditor would need at that moment goes down because risk has been managed essentially by increasing the confidence in that criteria. But currently, that's not the case. Currently, we don't have that confidence. And so my big push in this meeting from the perspective of BABL and our experience is that there needs to be a significant amount of training. There needs to be a significant amount of specialization. And we have to specify kind of more explicitly what kind of training actually these auditors need to have. There's no doubt that they have to have sort of standard assurance audit kind of accountant type training and certifications. That's a given. You need professional people who have professional codes of conduct and are going to behave in ways that are trustworthy. But then on top of that, there has to be some subject matter expertise, at least in these early stages. And so this was and we submitted comments to this group after the meeting hopefully it will get to the European Commission directly. And but I wanted to just report on this because it's relevant for this push, and everything I'm seeing is sort of going more and more towards the fact that the algorithmic auditing community is sort of breaking out into the mainstream, and it's going to be required by many, many laws. All right. So speaking of many, many laws, let me now reflect on what happened a couple days ago in the hearing for New York City. So in January 23rd, the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection held I think this was the third one. This was the third sort of public hearing for rulemaking. And if you don't count the one that basically crashed because too many people showed up. But this was very interesting. So there's been three rulemaking sessions where they had this hearing. The first one was essentially how much, talking about the fines, how much are you going to get charged if you violate the law. That was, I think there was very few people showed up to this. I think myself and Professor Stoyanovich from NYU, she spoke. Ryan Carrier spoke from ForHumanity. And I think that was it. I think there was three of us. And very few people on the call. The second meeting, which had more explicit rules about what a bias audit should be, there was a lot more people in that one, and it indeed crashed their system, and they had to use a different platform to have the meeting. And now this is the third one. And so, let me first say that there were a lot of people there. It was approaching 300. It was a lot, 200 and something large. So there clearly was a lot of interest. The surprising thing, though, is that only 10 people spoke. Now, more people submitted comments, and at least publicly, and then probably behind the scenes in terms of directly emailing the department, probably there were a lot more people submitting comments. But in terms of speaking publicly, there were not that many. And of the people who spoke publicly, there are essentially, I think, 7 or maybe 8 that were sort of pro or encouraging of the law, let's say. But there was quite a bit of support for the law itself. the major sticking issues, the things that came up in the meeting that were, I think, the main themes of the meeting were the scope. So the scope, actually, that was kind of the primary theme, I think. There are other bits that people talked about, but I think almost everybody mentioned the scope, and either mentioned it in the sense that they liked the scope. That was a couple groups, but then the majority of people did not like the scope. And so I've talked about this on this webinar before, so I won't get into this too much, but in essence, the way the language of that law is currently written, the scope is very narrow, in fact. And so what gets counted as an automated employment decision tool, I should probably say, if you don't know anything about this law, it's just a law that requires bias audits for tools that are used in New York City or on New York residents who to make hiring or promotion decisions. And in order to be sort of under this law, to be in scope so that you have to have a bias audit, the current language makes it such that essentially it has to override human decision making. So if you have a human doing anything or making the ultimate decision, then you don't have to worry about it. That's essentially what the current language says. So that would mean that even if you have a number that sort of assists you in making some sort of ranking or something, that doesn't count. It has to literally just filter someone out. And there are tools that do that, and they will definitely be in scope. And the other issue was whether it's machine learning or not. And so whether it has to be AI, machine learning, data analytics, statistical modeling. And the current rules, basically, the language is such that only machine learning and only a very narrow type of machine learning counts. So everybody, or 7 out of the 10 people who spoke, focused on that issue and said that the scope is so narrow. A few people even said that the law would basically be useless. And some of the people were included people who voted for this in the city council. And so they were on record expressing what the intent of the law was. And there's an article was written, I think H.R. Brew wrote an article, I think yesterday or the day before, talking about this and essentially saying that there was a lot of opposition to this narrowing of the scope of the law. So my instinct is that there's going to be some changes made to this. Exactly what the changes will be and how significant it broadens the scope, but I'm pretty confident that they're not going to just pass it as is, given the current pushback. And we'll see what the other comments say. Maybe it was just the public. Maybe it was a biased view of people who were willing to step up and speak publicly about it. It could be that there's lots and lots of comments that came in via email that were going in the opposite direction. So that's sort of the unknown at this point. But there is some media attention on it now, and so I think we'll find that it's not going to be a simple pass. It's not going to pass as is. There will be probably another round, and they might pass the elements of it that were acceptable to most people, and others that weren't. They'll wait until another round of comments. Another issue that came up here in the comments, and it actually it's come up both here and in the Digital Services Act meeting that I was at. It came up at the meeting yesterday that I spoke at regarding algorithmic auditing in Latin America, is the issue of auditors and oversight of auditors. And this is something that it's a testament to how seriously people are now taking this, that this is a conversation. And so that's exciting to me, that it's really now in the forefront of the mind that how are we going to audit the auditors and how are we going to manage that? And I think it's very clear that we now need to, as a community, start moving towards uniting and coming up with some set of standards that we can all abide by. Now, the ecosystem currently is totally crazy. It's like the Wild West, in the sense that there are a bunch of firms that offer kind of audit services, including BABL. There are the sort of traditional firms like the Big Four and other sort of accounting firms that do financial audit or do assurance, like regulatory assurance or IT auditing. And then there are, IO psychology firms. In the case of HR, for instance, there are individual like IO psychology firms that would be able to do these sorts of audits. And so there's a lot of different standards. And BABL, we follow ForHumanity's rules. ForHumanity's rules are basically the same as sort of Big Four type accounting standards. But that's not necessarily the only way to do it. And so I think there's going to be a quick move. So if I were to predict what's happening in 2023 for algorithmic auditing, is that we are going to start seeing a lot of action in a variety of jurisdictions, including North America and Europe, or in particular North America and Europe, but Latin America is right there as well, to really kind of hone in on what do we mean when we say an auditor that's going to audit algorithmic systems. And some of the things that are at stake are, whether these are direct engagements where you have data scientists that are literally testing for bias or testing for robustness or all the various technical metrics or socio-technical metrics that you might see in NIST's risk management framework. Or are these going to be attestation engagements where you make the company do it and then the auditors are going to verify what the company does is sufficient up to a standard? And so these are open issues now. And I think we're going to see in 2023, those issues have to get hammered out because in New York City, there are audits that are required already. It's going to happen April 15th. So we got to figure this out. Digital Services Act is going to require auditors. It's going to, by the end of this year, we got to have that figured out because the requirements are coming next year. And there are other laws that are coming along. So, for instance, Colorado law is passed already for insurance. If they make rules requiring auditing, then that has to be sorted out. New Jersey just passed through into committee, I think, in New Jersey, a law that's extremely similar to the New York City law. So this is now state level in New Jersey. And it's focused on hiring as well, just like in New York, except that the scope is larger in terms of the protected categories. So they don't focus, at least in the current version of the law, they're not focusing on just what are called component one categories, which is race, ethnicity, and gender. And so this would include all of the protected categories like disability, pregnancy status, there's age, all of these will be included. And so, and this would require audits as well. And so that's another area that these things have to get sorted out. Also, which is a surprise that just happened 2 days ago that I heard about, is that New York State now is pushing through I don't think it's passed. It's not out of committee yet, but it's being considered and it has a draft. It is a law which is very similar, but it focuses on data protection. So at its core, it's sort of a data protection kind of law, but it has components regarding algorithmic fairness, very specific components. And it also includes the requirement to do things like impact assessments and potentially auditing. And so, and then California also has rules that are going to likely require audits. And so, long story short, all of the arrows are pointing towards us needing to figure this out this year. This year is going to be a critical year for this entire ecosystem. And so, what I'm seeing is we're going to have to be really engaged. Those of you out there who are listening, who are also in this field or want to get into this field, I think we need to start ramping up our efforts to really figure out how this industry is going to grow, what the ecosystem is going to look like, who is responsible for doing what in terms of making criteria, translating the laws into criteria. I think ForHumanity is a great organization to do that, but other people may have different opinions. How are we going to certify and verify that auditors are appropriately trained and following the right code of conduct. Again, ForHumanity has many elements of that, but I think they're at the level of the firm. There has to be even more emphasis on appropriate training, and so I want to finish up basically by with my thoughts on this, because I feel like BABL is actually in a good position to reflect on some of this. And we're not a massive firm, and so it's not like we our what we say should go, but we do have a lot of experience. We've done a lot of research. So we have both academic research, which we have spent sort of dedicated time trying to figure out what kind of governance techniques should work, what do risk assessments look like. In our practice, we've road tested these risk assessments in a variety of different industries, anywhere from HR to ed tech to autonomous vehicles, working with the military on risk assessments related to autonomous weapons. And so we've looked at a wide range of these risk assessments, and we've kind of worked on figuring out how can they be made effective, how can they be made repeatable. We've done a lot of work on bias testing, both directly bias testing, testing systems, collecting data, coming up with metrics, doing risk assessments, and also auditing other people's bias testing, in particular in the context of the New York law, but now expanding into other industries. And so all of that is to say, I feel like we actually are quite well situated to weigh in on the kind of training that needs to get done. And so my plan for BABL in 2023 is to put together essentially an auditor's bootcamp. And the idea is, we've already started some training classes, but really put together a curriculum for the core competencies that algorithmic auditors are going to need. And I think not just including sort of the subject matter competencies, which I think we have focused on a lot, but also the sort of professional ethics, the professional procedures, the standard of professional conduct, putting together training for that as well. And so we're going to rely pretty heavily on current standards for auditing. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here. But what we can do and what we should do is tailor it towards the unique risks that are associated with algorithmic auditing. So we're not auditing financial statements. There are different sets of risks that are involved, and those have to be known and considered by auditors in this space. And I think instead of doing this in the sense that we're just providing training and people can take our courses or whatever, I think what we're going to focus on is making this kind of a hardcore certification where essentially we want to use this to train our own people who are going to eventually work with us to do audits, but then make it available for other people, because the hope is that there are going to be many auditing firms like us out there. We need the competition because we do consulting services, and we can't audit people who we consult with. And so there's a conflict of interest there, and so we need other auditors. And so I think that I'm going to be making this curriculum with my team. We're going to be putting these courses together. We'd already been thinking about this, but now it's very obvious that there's going to be a need for that, even just within our own company because we're growing, but potentially other people as well. And so I'm excited about this process because I think 2023 is going to be the year of the AI auditing or algorithmic auditing, the year that it really breaks into the mainstream, that it's one of those things that it's on everybody's mind. Just the number of meetings, the number of things I've been invited to over the course of this last month, just in the last 2 weeks, it's clearly very front of mind for a lot of people. And so I think now is a great time for us to start thinking about if I had to take somebody from sort of zero to an algorithmic auditor having full skills that they need to do these sorts of assessments in a sort of robust way that has a lot of integrity and then catches most of the risks. I think we're at a place now where we know what those capabilities need to be, and we can start pointing people and producing the kind of training that's needed for those. All right, so I've done enough talking. I don't see any questions. Let me just say, if you do have questions, why don't you pop them in the Q&A while I sort of sum up here, and then if any questions come up, I'll answer those. So to recap, a huge amount of things going on. First thing is AI risk management framework is being launched as we speak by NIST. This is going to be extremely influential. I think you're going to see ripple effects across the globe in terms of what people are pointing to when they're talking about standards, and this is going to be one of those sort of foundational standards. And so we need to pay attention to it, and we as auditors need to start making sure that we are able to assess people against that standard. And so that work is starting now. In Europe, Digital Services Act requires auditing. It's going to happen soon. I was invited to a workshop to discuss how this might unfold and to give feedback. I think the main concern there was, we need those standards. We need auditable criteria because auditors don't feel comfortable yet. We don't have enough information, and so that has to get done. And then the big question of who is an auditor and what kind of training do they need has run through many different meetings. The one in Catholic University of Chile that I just went to, the New York City bias audit public hearing, which we gave testimony in. Some of the comments that came from industry was worried about the maturity of this field. I won't name any names, but you can go look it up. And so I think it's now is the time for the real growth and maturity of this field this year. And, we're excited to be part of that. And hopefully we can take some leadership role in helping the community as a whole kind of develop the right kind of standards so that we can ensure that when we're auditing these systems, that we're doing the best job we can to protect humans. All right. So I don't see any questions now. Thank you, everybody, so much for showing up and listening to my Lunchtime BABLing. If you're watching this, listening to podcast, thank you for tuning in. If you're on YouTube, then feel free to like and subscribe and all of that stuff. And I'll see everybody next Thursday.